All right. Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining me this evening. We're going to be taking a look at rainwater harvesting and rainwater management this evening. We tried to give this talk last week, and thank you very much to Councillor Joan Jones. She contacted me and asked if I would like to present to the district, and I did, but unfortunately we had a failure last week with the projector. So within about 2 minutes of starting, that was the end of that talk. So this was our second choice, and I think it's a good one because we'll be able to post this video afterwards for other people to reference if they wish. All right, so without further ado, well, let me just share my screen here. Okay. And there we go. All right, so thank you again, everyone, and for your patience. For those who were at the Legion last week. So we got the first few slides under our belt, but we're going to go through those again. And just a short introduction from my part. Tonight's title is going to be Rainwater Management, our untapped resource. And this is one of those prime days when we can see how we could do so much better with our rainwater management. We've got a huge volume of water that's come down already today, and it looks like we're in for a little bit more this evening. All right, sorry about this. I'm just trying to admit somebody. Okay, I'm gonna have to go away from that. There we go. So I won't be able to do that during our talk here. So let's get back to that. There we go. All right. So here we go. We're going to be talking about rainwater management and just a little bit about myself. I've lived in Lantzville. I guess we've been here 27 years, my wife and myself, and we co-owned our property here with my parents. And we're going to take a little bit of a journey through our homestead during the evening here and touch on that. But again, I've been here 27 years and I'm a regenerative landscape designer and a contractor. I worked with Oregon State University with their online permaculture design course and an instructor with them. I way back about 38 years ago, I took a apprenticeship program with the Vancouver Park System, and that got me set on my way in the landscape industry. And just recently, in the last decade, I took some training through ARCSA, which is the American Rainwater Catchment Systems Association, as well as CanArm, which is a Canadian equivalent. So aside from that, I've also taken some agrarian farm scale training. So I've loved learning, and I'm continuing to upgrade my skills as the years go by. So I have no intention of stopping work for this at this point anyhow. So here's some pictures of our homestead. My beautiful wife Angela and my mother here. My father would have been in this photo, but he died last year, so he is no longer with us. But he was 102 and thoroughly enjoyed his time on our property here. We do all kinds of things, including collecting rainwater, as you can imagine, and we're going to talk about that. We have a few chickens. We grow 95% of our own vegetables, and there's the odd thing we don't grow, but then we access all of our meats from local ethical farms that are in the area. And I guess in the last 27 years, we've had a lot of opportunities with our business building landscapes, designing and building landscapes for others around the island and on some of the Gulf Islands. And recently we're doing a lot more work in, again, the agricultural design sector, where we have quite often younger couples buying ALR properties and wanting some sort of guidance and a design in place for their future farm. So that is a little bit about myself. And tonight, what I'm hoping to do here is look at the following. So we are going to be looking at various ways we can collect rainwater, whether those are active rainwater collection or passive. So there's two different types there that are distinctly different. Some of the key factors that we want to consider when we're doing both. And we're going to look at some of the piping and filters involved with active collection, as well as cisterns, storage containers. And then we're going to take a look at some permaculture or regenerative design strategies. So today's format, what I'm hoping to do is we're going to have a 1 hour presentation, and then we've got about half an hour here for some Q&A if anybody has any questions at all. And if nobody has questions, I do have a couple extra slides that we can look at, and which is always fun. So just a little bit about rainwater. It's quite amazing that at any given moment, I would say there's approximately 10 trillion gallons of water in the air around the world. And it's quite amazing, the quantity of moisture that's in our atmosphere. And this is just a little diagram about the water cycle itself, and how that water is always in motion, right? It's either evaporating, it's coming down in rain, it could be going across the surface, it could be infiltrating, and ultimately much of this water ends up in the ocean. So rainwater is distinct, and when we're collecting that, we don't want to get this mixed up with other types of water. So there's storm water, okay? That's water typically off of paved areas, or that sort of thing. If you go to Home Depot in the parking lot there, and on a day like this, all of that water is heading across the surface and into storm drains, okay? And then there's gray water, which is often a product we can optimize in our households. It's often water that's coming from showers, or say the kitchen sink, some sinks, and that's an underutilized resource. And we're not really going to talk a lot about it tonight, but that's something that is one of those low-hanging fruits. We have potable water, which is self-explanatory. It's water that meets the Canadian drinking water standards. We have groundwater, which is actually part of our aquifer, and we have surface water, so water that may be sitting on the surface. So they're all slightly different definitions, and tonight's focus is going to be all about rainwater. So what is it? Well, it's a roof-based system of collection, or it could also be land-based. But when we're collecting off the land, we're doing distinctly different things with these. So that's one thing that we're going to cover tonight. So when we're collecting off a roof, we are looking at catchment area, so the roof area itself. We're looking at conveyance piping. So that's piping that is moving the rainwater from the roof surface to the cistern. We're going to look at storage and pumps, and the all-important overflow. And that's a very important part of the system here. All right, so there are different types of rainwater harvesting systems. And first, we're going to look at active. So this is probably the most common. This is what most of you would, I'm sure, be thinking about when we talk about rainwater harvesting. We're taking it off of a roof, and we're going to store it in a cistern for later use. And in this example, it is called a dry pipe non-potable collection. That's kind of a typical example that you're seeing here. So if we kind of run down the diagram, we're looking at the roofing. We're also looking at a gutter, screen on top, then we're into a downspout. And then we are also, let me get my tool here. We have a primary filter, or what's called a rain head, and that's an important piece that we're going to look at tonight, as well as a first flush device. So we're going to divert a little bit of that initial water away from storage, and we're going to basically send it back out into the environment because it's not the type of water we ultimately want to collect. And then we have the storage itself with an overflow, and that may or may not have a pump on it. There's lots of things one can do, but in this case, we've omitted the pump. So if we were to take a look at a wet pipe, so the last slide was a dry pipe, and what that means is when the rain event is complete, the conveyance system, that piping system, is emptied, and including that first flush diverter. And we're going to get into that a little bit more. But with a wet pipe, these are fascinating because in a dry pipe system, we have to have gravity working for us to get it into the cistern. When we're looking at a wet pipe, we're actually putting that conveyance piping underground and then bringing it up to the side of the cistern and in, so that when the rain event is over, technically that water, there will still be water charged within that line. So there are some strategies we can use to empty that out so we don't have any frost issues during the colder part of the year. But this is more typical of a potable system. Now, when I say that, I mean it'd be a larger cistern, and then we have a lot of filtration that goes on after the fact, as well as disinfection with a UV. So we're just going to touch on some of the parts that are involved with active rainwater harvesting. So putting that water into a cistern. So some of the materials potentially that could be used in construction of this would be concrete, and there's plastic or polyethylene. Fiberglass is another one. And a lot of that has to do with your economic decision and the strength that you need. So when we go and we bury tanks in the ground, they need to be able to withstand the forces of that burial. So they subsequently cost quite a bit more, and that may or may not be something that works in someone's budget. So here's some polyethylene tanks. The photo on the top left is actually Angela and my part of our setup. That's as we were expanding it. And on the right there is a system we did on Denman Island, where that was 9,000 gallons. So that's just 3,000 gallon cisterns all tied in at the bottom. So as one fills, they all fill together, and the same when you discharge it. And in that example, we have a little pump house, and there was some fire suppression built into that for this property. Some other varieties of tanks. There's bladder tanks, which I am not a big fan of. I've heard these are just, they remind me of a large waterbed mattress, and often they're in really difficult areas, like in crawl spaces. Now, if you bear in mind that a gallon of water is typically 10 pounds, then a 2,000 gallon pillow is 20,000 pounds. And if for some reason that starts to move under your house, which it could, in certain conditions. It's not a good outcome there. And personally, I don't like this approach, but for some people, that is all they can do. The other is these really slim cisterns they have for tough spaces, very narrow spaces. So this is an interesting system. It doesn't hold a lot of water, but for the right client, that may be all they need. What most people find is when they start collecting rainwater, they just want more and more and more. So bigger is better. This is typical of, say, a commercial installation where they've used fiberglass tank, and you'll notice there's some metal straps on that, and it's basically anchored to a concrete ballast. So when you're burying tanks, one of the factors you have to consider is when the tank is empty, if we have a high water table, what's going to happen is that tank going to start moving, which it will if it isn't anchored, or it has the potential to move. So the ballast is installed and calculated based on the worst case scenario of a high water table and no water in the cistern, and that'll keep it in place. So one of these pre-storage treatments that we look at, because personally I like to filter all their rainwater as much as possible before it enters the cistern. That way we have the highest quality water we can get, and it will have we'll have a much easier time delivering it if we, say, push it through drip irrigation, which requires at least 200 microns of filtration in order to ensure it doesn't clog up your system. So with these screens that are on the left, they're called leaf eaters, and they are that point of connection between the downspout and your conveyance system. So often we'll cut into the downspout on at the side of the house, and we'll place one of these leaf eaters below that cut, and then we'll transition into PVC piping. And that way, we're not getting any vectors coming through into the conveyance system, right? So as soon as the water enters the conveyance system, there's no mosquitoes, there's no rodents, there's nothing getting in there that's under 1,000 microns, or sorry, over. It's 1,000 micron screen at that point, at that initial point. So one of the other options we have when we're trying to divert, dirty, we'll call it dirty water, from a roof. So like this here, we had a really long dry spell. So that first rainfall that hits our roof, we know there's a lot of dust and contaminants coming off of it. And in that case, a device called the first flush really works well. And all it does is divert the first bit of water off of the roof, and it separates it. It takes it out of the conveyance system, and then you are putting a cleaner, more appropriate water into your cistern. Now, the downside of the first flush is that you need to maintain it, because at the very bottom of that pipe, once the rain event is over, there's a little dribbler at the bottom, and that'll slowly leak out so that the pipe is dry and ready to go again. The only challenge with that is that dribbler has to be maintained, and the actual first flush itself is calculated based on how much of that initial rain we want to remove. So, which is quite easy to do. It's just sizing it appropriately. And there's a couple of other options. There's, on the right-hand side, there is a first flush that is horizontal and is placed underground. We've used these before. They work really well. It's a similar concept where water rushes into that chamber, and it pushes a ball up and seals the very end. And that is the diverted water, and then it diverts away from the chamber into our collection. And the one on the left there is called a Wizzy filter, and it again is very effective. Not so good when it's just drizzling, but when the rain has come down pretty good, it's quite effective. And there's a couple of examples of a first flush. So on the left, you can see the primary filter is way up high in the picture, and there's some piping below it, along with a T that goes off to the storage tank. So the bottom of that T, you can see that whole chamber, that is the first flush device that dribbles into the drain after the rain event. And then again, once that all is full, the water is then redirected into they have quite a small cistern in this example. And on the right, that's a very large commercial first flush device. That's about 12 inches around, but it's the same principle. It's just taking a certain amount. It's usually the first half millimeter of rain, and you can calculate that with the roof area and know how many liters of water that is and size the first flush based on that. So it's a pretty effective. But again, the bottom of all these units you have to maintain, or this will not dribble out effectively. So I'm not a huge fan of first flushes because I've seen them fail. And the only reason they fail is because the maintenance end. That's just one other thing that people don't want to deal with, and I totally get it. So it is very hard to get away from some level of maintenance. This is one of my favorite options, and it's one we did at our home, and we'll see a few pictures of it later. But basically what we do is we have and the same with this example, this is a small pump chamber. It's only about 50 gallons, and it's buried below ground, and the top of that lid is at grade when it's all backfilled. In this example, and then there's a basket inside the filter. So the rainwater comes in the top through that open pipe that you see. And in this example, it was collected off of all of the roof surfaces on this house. And what we do is on the right-hand side, you see that white fabric, that white fabric filter. That's called a Tuffy filter. And we will put that in with the coarse basket. And we get 40 microns of filtration when we do that. So it's extremely effective. Now, saying that, we still have to maintain the Tuffy filter. We have to take it out, and you can hose them off a number of times, and then eventually you have to get a new one. But those were made, fascinating story. Those were made for the dairy industry. So they are used in that industry, and it was, in the last 10 years adopted into rainwater harvesting, because we can get, it's a huge surface area and we get really good filtration. So we're going to look at this kind of system again a little bit later, but basically what happens as the water fills that chamber, we have an effluent pump that's in the bottom. It's like a sump pump. So as the level comes up, the pump turns on and it pushes all that water up to the cisterns for storage. And in this example, we'd also had a float in the cistern, a couple of floats, one to tell us when it was full of water, and it would cut power to the pump. And when that happens, then all the water just goes into overflow. So again, that's a really important redundancy to add to a system, is overflowing. Okay, and here's this a beautiful filtration setup, but again, it needs a little bit of maintenance. We're not seeing it in action here, but basically water comes in the right-hand side, that top right-hand side Fernco fitting with the band on it, and the water will basically dump out the bottom into the tank. and the dirty water gets pushed out the other upper area, and that goes off into the sanitary sewer or storm or wherever you're hoping to push it. So this is a really nice filter as well. We are going to take a quick peek at the importance of overflow here and the calming inlet. So these are more details that you may not be interested in, but basically if you send rainwater into a cistern, there is this biofilm inside the cistern, and you don't want to disturb it. It's actually a living biofilm that interfaces the water to the tank. And if we send the water in just through the top of the cistern, we get quite a bit of disturbance, and we'll get a lot of sediment moving around in that cistern. So if we do, in this example, a calming inlet where the water comes down a pipe and then basically shoots back up this basically a T and a couple of 90s. We have the water pushing up into the cistern and not disturbing the sediment at the bottom. So even if you're doing a lot of filtering with your rainwater, you eventually do get a buildup of some material. And I can say with our cistern, we have a cistern that's 25 years old and it's never been cleaned out. So there is a small amount of debris in it, but it is not by any means a concern. So one reason I really like well, not over filter, but to filter well before we're into the storage. So if we look at the overflow here, typically we'll cut that overflow on an angle so it siphons off the surface of the water, any particulates that may end up there. And then we just have a couple examples of some active systems, and then we're going to look at a different type of rainwater harvesting. And the downside of these active systems, I would say, is the cost. They're not cheap to put together, whether you're the Central Saanich Fire Department or whomever. In this case, they have these galvanized cisterns that are they're lined with poly, and they can capture a substantial amount of water here. When these are filled, it then is designed to go into a series of rain gardens and bioswales, so the water is being infiltrated back into the landscape, which is a wonderful idea. And this is another example in Abbotsford, I believe. Yeah, and here the rainwater that's collected is used for the toilet and urinal flushing. And then there's just a couple examples here, one in Lantzville that we did quite a while ago, and we kind of incorporated the conveyance piping into a landscape feature at the side of the house. And there's a couple of, that's basically two low profile 2,000 gallon cisterns and quite a large first flush. And then we designed this system, and our client installed it, and they did a great job. They only made one little boo-boo, and so that's pretty good. It's actually where the gutter and the first initial leaf eater filter meet. You need to have some space there for debris to be shed out of the system. That's a little bit tight there, but they did a great job, and they've got 8,000 gallons, and that was for a nursery setup. And we did a nice little system in the noose where we used different type of filtration, but the same idea. We're trying to get that water as clean as possible. And in this case, if you look at the photo on the left, there is what's called a sliding gate valve about halfway up that pipe. So when the cistern's filled and you pull that lever into the open position, all the water goes to where it used to in the storm drain. So we like building in bypass for these systems, because they do fill up pretty quick, and there's no point in filtering water that you're just sending back out to the landscape. And then this is our little system that we've put together. We just added this pump chamber over the fall, and believe it or not, our 11,000 gallons is completely filled as of last week. So even today, all of our rainwater is not going into storage. We're sending quite a bit to a rain garden we have, but yeah, we've already filled up all our needs. Well, not all our needs, but all our storage capacity for next year. So the one part about rainwater harvesting that I find most exciting, I love capturing water in cisterns, but passive rainwater harvesting, I think, has such potential in all communities on the island. And, you know, especially Lantzville, because before we had our hookup to City of Nanaimo water, we were having to make it on our own. And this is one way that I see it, you know, water that would normally end up in our storm system being re-infiltrated back into the landscape. So we have a little definition here of passive rainwater, and that's basically we're collecting and infiltrating rainwater into the ground. And we're not putting it in a tank, so we're putting it in the ground. And of course, the ground, doing that is far less costly. It has a huge impact. And we saw that with our rain garden this year. Last fall, we installed one, and it collected a substantial amount of water over the winter. And then, of course, we had quite a drought this year, but our fruit trees that were positioned below our rain garden never skipped a beat, and quite amazing the lasting effect of that strategy. So there are some really simple things. We're starting very simple here with the passive structures. Is you could just have a basin. So as you know, if you dig a depression, you're going to have water collect in that. And then what'll happen is after it rains, that water will typically infiltrate below. Now, this is all based on having the right soils, but I'd say Lantzville is pretty well positioned that way. I know where we are in Upper Lantzville, we have a sandy loam, so it's kind of a very sandy, gravelly soil that infiltrates very, very quickly. If you had clay, say you were in a lowland and had a bit of heavy soils, you had more than 30% of clay in your soils, then these type of systems would not be good, because you'd basically be ending up with a pond versus an infiltration pit. Yeah, so you can do swales. I'm sure a few people have heard that word before, and swales really are just ditches of sorts, but they're a little bit different in that we can plant them differently than we would a ditch. A ditch is often just scraped out, and it's quite amazing when you think about it, the fertility in most ditches and how quickly the vegetation grows. And that has a lot of there's a lot of similarities with swales and rain gardens as well. That's where all the water goes, and with that, fertility follows. So in this example, and it's well, it's an example of a swale, but you can see all the planting that's downhill from this, how it would benefit from that water table being established. Now, I shouldn't call it a water table. They call it a water lens or a plume. And over time, it will increase. Now, saying that, when I went through my permaculture design training, I was quite excited about swales, and I put them in a few landscapes that we were doing. And they worked quite well, but they fell a bit short of what my expectations were. And I must say that the rain garden concept has really filled that quite nicely, and we're going to take a look at that tonight. So one thing that's very interesting that they do in Tucson, Arizona, and that's where these images, Brad Lancaster in Tucson, Arizona, he's written a few books that I would highly recommend. Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond. He's got 2 volumes set, and they are fantastic. He's got a great website too. Just even checking that out, it's really informative. Now, you might say, well, this person's in Tucson and we're in the west coast of British Columbia, and they're very different climates. And you'd be quite right. They are, but there are aspects of these strategies that we can I won't say manipulate, but we can tweak a little bit to fit well into our climate. So we know that we get long, hot summers. They're very dry for the most part, right? Not every year, but most years. And we know most winters are kind of like today. They can be, we get most of our rainfall in November, December, January, and those are months when most things are dormant. So they're really not helping us out. So the one thing that we need to be careful of is that if we're collecting rainwater into basins during the winter, that we're not drowning out our plant material. There needs to be some thought given to those plants and how they are going to survive through both sort of a flood event and a drought event in the summer. So that's where rain gardens come in. And there are a number of different approaches to it. This is a very typical section drawing of a rain garden that you might find next to parking or next to a roadway. It is fairly, well, I won't say over-engineered, but they've been quite careful here to have a large rock and drainage pit at the very bottom. And I understand that for certain settings, that is a great idea. For most residential settings, that's not required. We just need to put in some, create a basin, put in some good growing medium and appropriate plant material, and we're off to the races. So this is a nice example. There are some in Nanaimo here. I should maybe update my pictures one day. Certainly around Buttertub Marsh, there's a development there that has some beautiful roadside rain gardens and bioswales. And, you'd probably drive by and not even really notice it if you didn't know they were there. They're just a depressed area between the sidewalk and the roadway. And the nice thing about these is they will take some contaminants off the road and remediate them before they get further along in the drainage system. So here's the rain garden, and I'm going to probably show you some other pictures a bit later if we have time. This is a rain garden just during construction on the left. I guess that was about October, November. And we just managed to plant the bottom of the basin at that time, and then a little further along on the right. And that was probably more like May. And here's a little rain garden we did in Nanaimo. It was collecting water that was at the back of the property behind these retaining walls and off the patio surface and the roof surface, and then pushing them into the rain garden at the front of the property. That then benefited the landscape that was downhill. And this is a little rain garden we did in Nanaimo, and you can barely even tell it's there. It's just to the left of the patio. It's this long, narrow rain garden collecting water off the rooftop. So that is a little bit about active and passive rainwater harvesting. What I want to do is just touch on a few strategies that everybody on the call today or watching this video could potentially implement in their own backyard or their own property. It again takes a fair amount of resources to put in an active system. Rain garden is definitely a good choice, very good choice. But there are other things that we can do, and I wanted to just touch on those today. So permaculture or regenerative land design is a slightly different approach to landscape design. And I'm not going to, we could spend weeks talking about that alone. But basically well, we'll take a look here. It's basically an ethics-based design system. And the ethics of it are earth care, people care, and return of surplus. And this was developed by Bill Molson and David Holmgren back in the 70s. And it was really created to help repair some of the damage that Bill Molson saw in our typical agricultural systems and how detrimental they were to soils and to habitat. So that's where this all started. And then it kind of grew from there. And it started getting into, you could apply it to many, many things. You can apply it to businesses. We apply it as designed to different properties. So it's quite an interesting approach, and it's actually a lot easier, I find, designing in this manner than it is the traditional with traditional landscape design, where you really are imposing your will on the landscape, or potentially. So some examples of that, this is probably one of the most well-known, the Lost Plateau in China, a severely degraded area, as you can see on the left. And the Chinese government realized that, there's about 2.5 million people that lived in this area that were impoverished because the land there was nothing there. It was completely denuded, overgrazed, for the most part, over a long period of time. So they initiated what is pretty much the largest permaculture scaled project, and they revegetated the area. And what they did was they were very careful about grazing, right? They made sure all the villagers followed a certain protocol, so there was grazing allowed, but it was well thought out and well managed. We see farm scale permaculture projects. Mark Shepard here in New Forest Farm in Wisconsin took an old burned out cornfield and created a diverse perennial and annual food system. So there are nut trees, there are berry bushes, there are annual crops, there are areas for livestock to run between the trees. There's just and now this farm is overproductive. They cannot keep up with what's going on. So I'm not sure if this is going to work. I'll just show you the first few seconds of this. A friend, Andrew Mollison, went to India and filmed this. So this is well worth checking out. I'll leave a link later in the show here.
These villages are facing a drinking water problem, scarcity of a drinking water. Now you can see.
So it's a pretty amazing story, and I highly recommend people check it out. I'll again, we'll have some links at the end of the talk. But that's Andrew Millison. He's from Oregon State University, and he created the Oregon State University Culture Design program. But he went over to India to learn more about their water challenges, because you can imagine that with our climate shifting, of all the countries that I'm aware of, Africa, India are a couple of the top ones that have probably the most brittle climate, very hard climate, and high temperatures. And so agriculture is a big challenge there. So urban scaled permaculture, there are a few sites. The image on the left is showing, this is Earthflow Designs, fantastic company down in LA. They take old sidewalks and make retaining walls out of them. So where LA is chopping up sidewalks to do road work and stuff, they palletize the material, and these guys use it in retaining structures. So great reuse. This is just a little project we did in Chemainus. So you can see there's a small swale with wood chip fill, and this collects water between the curb and this bed here and helps to infiltrate that. And then we have sort of a clover fescue ground covered grass. So again, the swale and rain gardens are all about benefiting plants that are downhill. And there's nice, that's sort of a typical image, permaculture image from a company in Victoria, Hatchet and Seed. And then there's some strategies that we can take away from today that I'm sure many of you will have heard about. The first obvious thing is to always have your soil covered, right? So with mulch, and that could be all kinds of things. That could, in a permanent planting, you could use wood chips from a tree company. You could use compost. You can use straw. Leaves are great. All kinds of different products can be used as a mulch, but covering the soil early in the year, so early in the spring, or later in the spring, can really help save vegetable garden, right? So as that soil heats up, that blanket of mulch is going to keep things cooler and also reduce evaporation. So there's and inhibit weed germination. There's a lot of advantages to, like, if you did nothing else and you put wood chips around your permanent plantings, you would see some benefit there right out of the gate. So this actually, some of you might notice this or recognize this. This is right at the end of the Sauzier Medical Clinic. This is we designed and built the landscape around this building. Gosh, it has to be 25 years ago. It was a long time. And back then it had no irrigation. There was no irrigation. So all the plant material that went in had to be able to handle it. So there are a couple of plants in here that we're very, very fond of. And the one that's flowering, that has white flowers, that's right along the edge there, that's called a sea kale, and that's an edible vegetable. Beautiful. It has little florets in the spring, and we have a lot in our garden, and just love growing them. So I had to throw this in because we've had a number of clients that had large lawn areas and really wanted to do something different with these that was somewhat cost effective, and had a really positive impact on the a good ecological footprint associated with it. So a meadow or even allowing grass areas to get long and have pathways mowed through them for your access is one thing that you can do. And the huge benefit, it's hard to emphasize the ecological benefit of this type of system. Even though it's not that high, you wouldn't think that's a big deal, but there is so much insect life that's dependent on these types of meadows that when you go and cut them, obviously you're doing a lot of harm, not only to them, but to their home, right? Where they want to try and establish a home. So this sort of approach where you're leaving some grass, allow it to get longer, you could shift into and in a smaller area, like one of the slides that I showed earlier, where we had a clover lawn. That's an option. We can blend clover with other grasses, and that just means you're having to mow less, which is a good thing. Another very interesting strategy is called hugelkultur, and it's the perfect fit for Lantzville. I think we've done a number of these mounds on our property over the years, and basically what it is, and I'll show you a project in the next slide here, but basically it's taking woody debris that that say is not firewood, right? Woody debris, and you're putting it in contact with soil, and often it's slightly buried, and then you are creating a growing area on top of that. So you get sort of a raised bed effect. You get the long-term benefit of this wood breaking down slowly. It's going to hold nutrients. It's going to hold water inherently. That those logs and that wood will be much like a sponge and just add a huge amount of organic material to the growing area. So this is a workshop I was at years ago on Gabriola, and this was kind of the beginning of Hugel Mound. You can see there was a trench that was formed on the left here, and then woody debris was placed in it, and then more debris was piled on top of it. And then there's a layer of compost or manure and soil, and then the subsequent crop here, where there's potatoes on the bottom and there's squash all over the top. So it's very, very effective. And something we're experimenting with this year is we last summer we purchased, I guess it was last summer, we purchased a biochar kiln, and it's a portable kiln. It's exactly what is shown here. So we are where we live, we get quite a bit of fuel load. We have 5 acres and a lot of trees, and I don't really want to just have a bonfire and not get a yield out of it, right? So there makes sense to try and reduce your fuel load. But with biochar, what we're doing is we're controlling the way that fire burns, and there's a very low oxygen environment at the bottom of that, and it's actually extinguished. You hose that down once it hits about 3 hours of burning, and then extract the biochar. Now, biochar is a really interesting material because it's basically carbon, and it's going to stay in that stable state for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's also going to become great habitat for soil organisms, for microorganisms. So a lot of times you'll see biochar blended with compost and then applied in a landscape. It can be used for animal bedding. There are so many uses for it. It's staggering, and it's really starting to get a bit of traction now. So we'll report back on our findings with this. Another thing that we do, not as much as we used to, but we we will create our own compost, really high quality compost, and then we will extract it. Now, I don't know if this, there we go. Uh-oh. So basically what it is, a vessel with an air being driven by air, an air pump, and we have a mesh bag that's filled with compost, and we put it in the extractor for about 20 or 30 minutes. And what happens is it strips all of the life forms off of the compost. So all of that soil biology, that diverse biology that's in the compost, is now in the liquid, but it's in an oxygenated environment. So it will, it's alive. And what we do if we're doing extract is we will then just empty the vessel into a watering can and apply it manually onto any growing areas that we want, in particular, like for annual vegetables. If they're struggling a little, this is a great way to give them a bit of a boost. You can also make compost tea, which is basically doing the same thing, but then adding some food and extending the brew time, 24 or 48 hours, to get a really dense population of organisms. So it is a much harder process. The extract is very, very much very simple. And so simple is often best, and that's why we will do that more often than not. And then basically that is the end of my presentation today. I have a few links here for everyone. And one is the Oregon State University, their permaculture design program. You can just Google that and find it. A good friend of mine and colleague at OSU has a incredible website called regenerativeliving.online. And if you go there, you'll see all sorts of homestead related online courses. There's live courses, and then there's also self-paced courses. That is a really incredible resource. Jan Designs, of course, that's my wife Angela and myself. That's our company. EcoSense Living, good friends in Victoria that have an incredible edible nursery, some very unusual plant material. And Hatch and Seed are a permaculture design, regenerative design company in Victoria. And they're doing a lot of really interesting work. And there's, for those on Facebook, you can always check out the Mid-Vancouver Island Permaculture group. That's one that we formed a number of years ago. There's CanArm, which is a Canadian version of ARCSA. Both are rainwater collection organizations that offer training. And one of a couple of other resources that you might find really nice, for anybody interested in a rain garden, if you are to Google the Rain Garden Handbook for Western Washington, you'll get a PDF download. That's just fantastic. It is a really good guide. It's something that I point out to all my Oregon State University students that are designing these. This is a really good blueprint to follow. And as well, the Rainwater Harvesting for Drylands and Beyond with Brad Lancaster. And again, he has 2 volumes of his book. Even if you just Google that name and go look at his website, it is fascinating. And there are so many interesting things that he has been exploring in Tucson, Arizona. All right. So let me just stop share. There we are. Now, unfortunately, there was a couple of people that tried to join during the call, but I was not able to let them in. However, there will be this this video available afterwards. So I'm not sure if anybody. Okay, so nobody put a question in the document. Is there anything anybody wishes to chat about with the time that we have left here? You can do a couple things. You can drop a question into the chat. There's a little chat box there. There should be an icon you click on and it'll bring up the chat. So Brenda's iPad is raising her hand. So you go ahead, Brenda. You can unmute yourself there. You should be able to. If you can't, I can help you out with. There we are. Hi.
Thank you for that. I was just wondering about old septic fields and converting them for collecting rainwater. We have one still sitting in our front yard. Do you have experience with that or advice? Is that worthwhile doing?
Well, my initial advice would be no.
No. Okay.
Yeah. It's a nice thought. It is.
Yeah.
There are a couple of reasons that it wouldn't be great. Well, for obvious reasons that you have a tank that's had sewage in it for years. Now, you could argue that that could be cleaned out. But the big thing would be the capacity. Like a lot of septic tanks are just not going to be large enough to have a meaningful quantity of collection.
Right.
And it's a little bit tricky figuring out your usage through the year, say in the landscape. But if you measure the area you want to irrigate, let's say, because that's what most people use their collected rainwater for. If you measure that area, so let's say it's 100 square meters. So if we stay in metric, it is much easier, even though it's maybe not everybody's favorite. But if you had 100 square meters and you're adding 25 millimeters of rain or of irrigation of water per week, that tells us that we have 2,500 liters of water. So 1 square meter, 1 millimeter of water equals 1 liter of collection. So that also is for collection, but that's also for application. So you can see 2,500 liters in 1 week on 100 square meters. That's just 1 week. And so that is part of the reason that I showed some other strategies. So for people to build soil so that it'll hold more water is probably one of the most cost-effective approaches. So a 1% increase in your organic matter content in your soil, whether it's your garden or your lawn, you'll be able to store another 20,000 gallons of water per acre.
Wow.
And that's on top of what your field capacity would be already. So that's kind of that low-hanging fruit that if we want to get the most bang for our buck, we want to build soil wherever it is.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, you are welcome. Let's see here. It looks like Joan has a question about worm farms. Go ahead, Joan.
Yes, thank you. I have a friend in New Zealand who has a worm farm in her yard. Sounds quite disgusting and fun to stick your hands into. And I was wondering what your experience is with them. I guess you would get an extract out of them, either the castings or something like a tea. But I'm concerned about the weather and whether they need light or shade and being dormant through the cold seasons, or how you protect them from cold and heat, and wondering what you have to say about them.
Well, worm farms are a great idea. Like cultivating worms are a great idea. How you do it, really it depends on the person's context. So where we live, we'll often get, you know, for a while there, we were getting a lot of wood chip deliveries from arborists. So let's say you had a wood chip delivery and you put some compostables in that over time, you know, whatever that may be. You'd have to be mindful of what you're doing because it's an open pile. But if you take a passive compost pile, so one that you're not managing, that you're adding material to, but you're not actively turning it and checking the temperature. It's not a hot compost. And you have that and you let that sit for a year or so. And the worm migration into that pile is just unbelievable over time. And that is what we eventually use 3 or 4 years later. We'll take that and use that as our extract. So you're quite right. Those worm castings are the most incredible product you can get. We just do that how we see the easy way, where we're not having to cultivate the worms in a smaller container, say in the house or outside, because they're very particular on the amount of moisture they want. They have to have at least 50% moisture to survive, and 70% when they're mating. And then if you get too much, then they're all going to try and leave. There can be all kinds of things. So you really have to be on it. And I love the idea. I think for some people, having them indoors is fabulous. If you can put the time and energy into them, there's some very low-cost systems you can put together using Rubbermaid containers and just making sure there's lots of aeration. And then if you have more space and you can do it outside, well, of course, that's, you know, the easiest possible approach.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I'm going to buy worm castings.
There you go. Now, let's see if anybody else had a question. Mark. Oh, you're very welcome, Mark and Robin. Glad you enjoyed it. Glad you enjoyed it, Elaine. That's great. And Glenn has a good question here. It is a direct message, but Glenn, would you be okay if we just sent this out onto the floor here? I'm sure you would be. No, I don't hear an objection. So Glenn's wondering about what you do to support, say, a 2,000 gallon tank, because a 2,000 gallon cistern, when it's full, even if it was polyethylene, so it's a fairly light tank, when it's full, it's 20,000 pounds of weight. So we do want to be mindful about the preparation. And basically what we do is we will use three-quarter crushed gravel. So it's like a road base. And you want to make sure you've got that compacted nicely and that it's coming off of firm ground. Like you wouldn't want to build on top of some old stump or something, you know, that's going to move over time. But yeah, we just use three-quarter crush. We used to use sand. We thought that was the way to go, but that's not the best material. It doesn't compact quite as well, but it also will move over time, whereas the three-quarter crush tends to stay right where we want it. You can do concrete. That would be overkill for a 2,000 gallon tank. When you're looking at 5,000 and up, that's when you start to have to get into some pretty serious reinforced concrete slabs. And what sort of face area for around the tank? So I think you mean space, how much space to leave around the tank?
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. We usually, it does depend on how much space you have to work with. So where we are, and we stage all our cisterns, it's right at the edge of a forest. We have lots of space, and I leave enough space to run a wheelbarrow between a cistern, just so I have really good access. You can tighten those up considerably if you need to, as long as you have really good access to the. If you have multiple tanks, one will always be your main pumping. Well, it may not be. One's going to be your main supply, where your supply will go in, and you'll want access there to possibly maintain that. With our system, we send rainwater, and then when we run out of rainwater in the summer, we start augmenting with our well. So we're able to put a dole valve on there to limit the flow of our well water, so we keep that just trickling if we need to. So hence every year we're looking at more and more storage. And you know, I would love to dig a large irrigation pond, but unfortunately our property isn't ideally set up for that. We don't have quite enough flat ground, but you never know, we might. And you have one other question here.
I've got about 20 square meters to put. I was thinking maybe 2 tanks.
Right.
Could I do 2 tanks on 20 square meters?
Oh, that sounds like you could easily do it. They're typically about 8.5 feet wide.
Ah, okay.
But you do need to prep an area. So you'd want to, it kind of depends on the context, what's around this spot. But when you go to, I mean, we're always wanting to try and collect as much as possible, but we did develop a little spreadsheet that helps calculate the water being collected off a given area and the usage. And that's really interesting to go through to see whether you're able to collect a meaningful amount, or whether you need to or whether an extra cistern will have any effect, right? It may not. We're kind of where we are. I mean, we've already topped up our collection. I wish I had twice as much storage, but cisterns just keep going up in price, and it's gotten pretty silly the last few years. So the 2000, I think you have a question there. What cost per tank? Let me see. The best bang for your buck used to be a 3,000 gallon tank, and now they don't make those, or at least Premier Plastics in Delta, who's our most favorite producer of cisterns. They don't make those. They make 2,500 though, and that just the tank and the wholesale is going to be close to 4,000, right? So, and that's not getting it. I mean, it's not that hard to install. I mean, it's never hard when you know how, right? But the prep is pretty the prep is pretty easy. It's actually putting things in the right place so that your gravity is working with you. That is part of it. And with our system, we had to consolidate everything into a corner of the house and into a pump chamber and pump it up to storage, which I inherently I don't like that, but it was the most practical approach. I would rather have it gravity filled and pump it later when I go to deliver it in the summer. But yeah, that's I hope I kind of answered your question. There's a couple of. Have you checked out the RDN rainwater harvesting guide? Have you seen that before?
I have.
Yeah, that's a really good guide. Yeah, it's not a how-to, but it does give you quite a bit of information. The how-to is the beginning first couple of projects. after training. It takes a little bit of time to get used to it, but they're not too hard. The filtration's the biggie. It's just getting that right, so your water is high quality when you go to use it. So
Yeah, I've got drip irrigation all around, so I'm working on trying to keep the water to feed it, so.
right. Well, some of the filters that I showed there would probably be worth looking at. If you're looking at parts, there's a firm called Bar Plastics, BARR, Bar Plastics in Abbotsford. They have a great online catalog, as well as Van Isle Water Service. They're on the island here in Victoria and Courtney, and we get materials off both of them. We don't get cisterns from them, but we get all the other stuff that's needed, filters and pumps, etc. They're a great resource.
Listen, thank you for this. It's very good information.
Oh, I'm glad to help. Yeah, I gotta thank Councillor Jones for inviting me. So
no, Joan, please, and thank you, Jamie. That was wonderful. Very generous of you to do this Zoom and to record it. I would like to get something in probably be the November issue of the Council's Corner, just letting people know that there's a recording of the workshop that they can look at, so that we can just keep generating the interest in this topic, because it takes time for people to put their mind to things like this, and
Sure.
We're years away from having a large portion of our population collecting rainwater, but ultimately the writing's on the wall. So
well, you never know. They may. In some ways, I think rain gardens are an easier fit for a lot of people because they're potentially less money. And one thing we didn't talk about was roofing materials. But if you have, let's say, an asphalt shingle roof, you've got to be really careful what you're doing with that water afterwards, because you have fire retardants and hydrocarbons coming off of the roof, and you're storing that. So you don't want to apply that to your vegetables. But that's where a rain garden is just beautiful, because it's going to help remediate all of that in the soil and compost and the plants themselves. So yeah,
I did have.
What's
Sorry,
that?
if you don't mind, I did have one more question about
sure.
the rain gardens. Where we live, the back of our property has a very high water table in the winter. I haven't dug down in the summer to see how much it drops, but it can be 18 inches down in the winter time. Is that kind of environment a deal breaker for a rain garden? Because
I would think so.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
Yeah, I would think you'd really not need to be infiltrating anymore if you're getting, close to capacity there.
Well, our grass stays green pretty much the whole summer. This was the first year we had some brown in it, but it wasn't all brown.
Now, one thing you could do is you could have a rain garden in place that you just activate during drier seasons, right? So say in March, if you see that water table dropping a bit, and you have a way of diverting water from wherever it's going now, maybe it's a rock pit or storm drain, and you can divert it into the rain garden at that time, you could see benefits with that strategy. The only thing is you're adding that sort of manual control.
A little bit of make work.
Well, not only that, you might not be right on turning it off or on at times. So but there's a possibility there. Depends on what type of roofing do you have. Are you asphalt shingle? I mean, most folks are. And but that's where rain gardens really shine, is you can really do a lot to clean that water up. Yeah.
I love the idea of a rain garden, but like you say, it might not be the best thing for us to play around with. But the raised garden beds with compostable, wood materials in the bottom would be fun for sure.
There's lots of information online about them. You can
Yeah.
take a pretty deep dive. And you're taking a product that's pretty plentiful in our typical, urban areas where acreage areas.
Mhm.
And a lot of people want to reduce fire hazard, and wow, that's just such a great way of doing it. Get some, some
Mhm.
plant fertility out of it. Yeah. Well, if nobody has any more questions, I think we'll call it a day here. And thank you again, Joan. It was great to
Thank you again, Jamie. Yeah.
be given an opportunity to chat with people and spread the word.
Well, Lantzville's really fortunate to have you as a resident sharing all this information. So many thanks. And I know people will be getting in touch with you and you'll be even busier than you are.
Yeah, well, that's
That's a
we're-
good
we're
sign.
running at capacity at the moment, but
I thought so.
yeah. But thank you very much again, and we'll look forward to seeing you again one day.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Bye.
take care.
You too.